Turn with me, if you would please, to Ruth chapter 4. If you've been with us as we've gone through this little book, you've seen that it has so much to say about God's sovereign providence, as well as the faithfulness and godliness of some of those Old Testament saints who stood strong and firm for Yahweh during a time characterized by ungodliness and false worship. It's important to keep in mind that Ruth is set against the background of the days of the judges, which were days of apostasy and spiritual darkness for the nation of Israel. But during that time, there were people who walked faithfully with the Lord, and Boaz and Ruth are two of them. Naomi is a woman who we have seen change in her outlook as the book progresses, from being an embittered woman because of what she perceived as God's unfair treatment of her, to a woman who trusts Yahweh to provide a redeemer for her and Ruth, and as we will see in this chapter, a woman who is blessed by God as he fulfills his sovereign plan. Now, as we've gone through this book, we've seen that the writer has very carefully drawn us into the story by building up the drama so that we wonder what will happen next. First, there was Naomi trying to send her two daughters-in-law back to their parents' homes in Moab and to let her go on to Bethlehem alone to live out her life as an impoverished Jewish widow. There was a lot of weeping and wailing and debating back and forth, and then one of them, Orpah, went back. But we see Ruth express her total commitment to Naomi and to Yahweh, and then go with Naomi all the way to Bethlehem. Then we saw Ruth go out into the field to glean, and she meets Boaz, who treats her very well. And when she gets home, she learns that Boaz is a relative of her deceased father-in-law and could potentially serve as a redeemer. Then we saw in chapter 3 that Naomi cooks up a scheme to have Ruth meet with Boaz at the threshing floor, and hopefully he will agree to serve as the kinsman redeemer. The tension builds until finally Ruth pours out her heart to Boaz, and he agrees to be her redeemer, but only if another relative, who is actually a closer relative than he is, turns down the opportunity to redeem her. So at the end of chapter 3, the story is at its peak of excitement. You know, what will happen next? Ruth knows she's going to get married, but to whom is not yet known. Will it be some other unnamed relative of Elimelech, or will it be Boaz? So that's where we find ourselves at the end of chapter 3. We aren't sure who the kinsman redeemer will be, but one thing was settled in chapter 3, and that is that there will be redemption for Ruth. So we're now at a climax, but it's a climax that doesn't yet have a conclusion, because all of a sudden we have another party introduced, another kinsman redeemer, and he has first rights, the first option to perform the redemption of Ruth and meet the biblical obligation. And so now we come to chapter 4, where we will finally find out how that will be resolved. Now, the truth is that while this chapter talks about the marriage of Ruth and Boaz, ultimately this story is not about their marriage. This is really a story about redemption. We will see Boaz redeem Ruth and make her his bride, and in the process, we will see that this is also a story about God's covenant faithfulness to Israel. The Jews haven't even thought about asking for a king yet. They're still in the days of the judges. But however, in his sovereignty and faithful love, God is already preparing ahead of time the line of the one who will ultimately meet that need. And we will see in this story that there is a parallel with Christ, who is our Redeemer, who has redeemed both Jew and Gentile and made them his bride. And I want you to notice as we go through this scene that Boaz is the one who initiates every step of the process of redemption. He goes to the gate, he speaks to the passing relative, he's the one who calls together the 10 elders to sit as witnesses to the transaction. Everything that takes place is because of Boaz's actions. That is significant because in our redemption by Christ, every action is also initiated by God. It is God who elects, it is God who calls, it is God who draws, and it is God who redeems us. And Boaz, as a picture of Christ, is the one who acts to carry out all of the steps of redemption in regard to Ruth. So as the story is told, this chapter breaks down into 5 sections. We'll look at each one. Let's begin with the first one, which is Boaz's strategic proposition. Look at verse 1. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. Behold, the kinsman redeemer of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, my fellow, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. Again, sometimes this story draws our attention directly to the sovereignty of God. Other times it's indirect, but you can't help but be impressed. Here we see Boaz go out and sit down at the gate of the city, and lo and behold, here comes the closer relative. In God's sovereignty, the relative comes by as Boaz is sitting there. Now, the gate of the city was the focal point of activity. In those days, the cities had very thick walls in which there were rooms built inside of them. You'll recall the story of Jericho, in which Rahab and her family lived in a house built on the city wall, and one of the windows looked out over the outside of the wall so that she let down the spies to escape from that way. So while the walls are very thick, there would be places in which there were rooms in which supplies were kept and shops were located and people even lived. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can tour the Jewish quarter and shop in the little shops which are built inside the wall of the old city. So the walls of Bethlehem would have been very thick, and there was space within those fortified walls for all kinds of purposes. And the area where the gate to the city passed through the wall was the business and judicial center of the city. It was the place where anything and everything of business and judicial importance took place. And there were little alcoves and little rooms built into the sides of the passageway so that those areas could be used to conduct your business and legal affairs. In fact, one Bible scholar comments that the phrase "go to the gate" was a Hebrew idiom for "go to court." So Boaz is going to resolve this matter legally. Now, in an agrarian society, almost everyone would pass through the gate either to go to or from the fields that were located outside of the city walls. And Boaz probably knew that this particular relative would pass by at some point that morning, headed out to his field. So this would have been the first thing in the morning as everybody was headed out to work, because Boaz wouldn't have waited all day to deal with this matter. Besides, he told Ruth in chapter 3, verse 13, that he would deal with the matter in the morning. He was a man of character, a man of his word. He knew this had to be resolved. If he waited until the end of the day, the relative may have been tired and exhausted from his work in the field that day and wouldn't have taken the time to consider the matter. So very early the next morning, Boaz is at the gate. In fact, it's unlikely he even went home. He probably went straight from the threshing floor to the gate. He had to get there early so that there was no chance that his relative would go out to the field before he had a chance to see him. And so the contact is established, and Boaz invites his relative to stop and sit down. Now here's where the author pulls an interesting trick on the reader. Notice that the relative is unnamed. My Legacy Standard Bible refers to him as fellow, but many other versions refer to him as friend. However, this isn't the Hebrew word for friend. It is a made-up term which has caused translators difficulty since the 4th century. It is a 2-word rhyme, poloni almoni. It's an artificially created wordplay in which 2 unrelated, meaningless, rhyming words are combined to produce a new term. In English, we have terms just like this, such as hodgepodge, helter-skelter, and heebie-jeebies. This same term is used 2 other times in the Old Testament to refer to places whose names are withheld. Interestingly, this term is still used in modern Hebrew to refer to an unknown or anonymous person. The Israeli police use it in the same way that American police use John Doe. So here we have a case in which the writer doesn't give us the name of this guy, and it's impossible to determine what it was. Perhaps the best way to understand this in English is Mr. So-and-so. So there have been all kinds of suggestions through the years, but there's no clear-cut answer as to how to translate it. One commentator suggested that we simply translate it, "Hey, you, come over here and sit down." That's probably as good a translation as any. Now, the real question is, why did the writer do this? Well, since this is the inspired Word of God, we know that God had a purpose in having the writer leave out his name. The obvious effect is to diminish our respect for him. There's certainly nothing said that is overtly negative about him, but like Orpah, who serves as the contrast to Ruth in chapter 1, this guy presents a contrast to Boaz. He may be the kinsman but redeemer, but he will very shortly be dismissed to the dung heap of irrelevance in terms of the theme of this book, which is God's preservation of the royal line of David and his redeeming grace towards the Gentiles. But this guy goes nameless because, after all, a man who refused to raise a name over the inheritance of his deceased relative deserves no name in the story. So whatever the meaning of Boaz's term for his relative, the man understood it and came over and sat down. Then verse 2, he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Now that action by Boaz would have made it obvious to the closer relative that there was a very important and significant legal issue at hand, particularly since Boaz had invited 10 elders to sit down and witness the transaction. That's the way that legal and business affairs were handled in biblical times. You simply transacted your business at the gate in the presence of witnesses. There was no written record with official signing of documents and filing with the local government officials. Rather, the presence of a number of witnesses was seen as the guarantee that the transaction was legally binding on all the parties. So Boaz selects 10 elders. There's no indication why he chose 10, because nothing in the law required 10, only 2 or 3. Later on in Judaism, 10 men were required to establish a synagogue, but not at this time. Verse 3, then he said to the kinsman redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the fields of Moab, has to sell the portion of the field which belonged to our brother Elimelech." Now, here is another piece of information that's new in the book of Ruth. Elimelech had owned land in Bethlehem. That part's not a surprise, but the way this is worded in English makes it sound like Naomi now owns the land. But there was no provision in the law for land to pass to a wife. It could pass to a daughter if a man had no sons, but normally not to a wife. However, Bible scholar Ian DeWeed has some good insight into this. He writes, quote, "Strictly speaking, as a widow, Naomi had the right neither to buy nor to sell the land outright. However, she could potentially control the right to use the land until the next Jubilee year. Those occurred every 50 years. This is technically what is on offer in this conversation," end quote. The laws concerning the sale of the land was covered in Leviticus 25. When a Jew sold his land, it was not sold permanently, but was sold for a limited time only. The original owner had the right to buy back any land which he had sold. Each tribe and clan had land which was allotted to it, and the land was to remain in your family forever. However, if you became so poor that you had to sell some of your land, there was a process established for that. So what probably happened was that before Elimelech headed out to Moab with his family, he had apparently sold his land to someone else, knowing that when he returned, as he originally planned to do, he could buy it back. You see, when you bought a piece of property from someone, you were really only buying it at a maximum till the next year of Jubilee. And when that occurred every 50th year, the land's ownership reverted to the original owner or his family. But during that time, if the guy who sold it to you wanted it back, he could buy it back from you. Now, if you couldn't afford to buy back land that you had sold, then your nearest kinsman could buy it back for you so that it remained in the family. If you had no relative to do that, then all you had to do was wait till the next year of Jubilee, and the land would revert back to you and your family. So in this case, Elimelech figured that he could buy back his land when he returned from Moab, but he died. And whoever he sold it to has now benefited from it for 10 years. And now Naomi is back and Ruth is with her. Technically, she doesn't own the land, but as Elimelech's widow, she can gain control over that land until the next Jubilee year, at the next Jubilee year. But that might be long after Naomi is dead, so she has no benefit from the land now, and she doesn't have the money to redeem it. So what Boaz is proposing is to Elimelech's closest relative is that he exercise the right to redeem the land for Naomi. Now it's interesting that Boaz began with the issue of the land rather than the marriage of Ruth. Some have accused him of not being above board by saving the issue of Ruth until after the relative commits to the purchase. However, it may be that Boaz simply wanted to make sure that he was completely above reproach in the matter. If he had brought up the issue of marriage to Ruth and the need to raise up an heir for Mahlon, and the closer relative refused, and then Boaz married and acquired the land, it might appear that he had swindled his relative out of the land. So he says in verse 4, "So I thought to uncover this matter in your hearing, saying, acquire it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if no one redeems it, tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you." Boaz calls on this relative to redeem the land which had belonged to Elimelech, and upon Elimelech's death would have passed on to Mahlon. And Boaz says, in effect, you have the first right of refusal. So I want you to know if you want to redeem it. It's important that we settle this, because if you don't redeem it, I'm next in line. I'll redeem it if you don't. And he says that he'll do so in the presence of the people and the elders who are sitting there. So that's the first part of Boaz's proposition, and that brings us to what I've titled the relative's impulsive pledge. The end of verse 4 tells us, and he said, I will redeem it. No hesitation whatsoever. He says he will redeem the land. I can just imagine what's going through this relative's mind at this point, because the Hebrew is emphatic. He is very eager to redeem the land. You see, normally the kinsman redeemer who redeemed the land back would have it to use until he was either paid back or until the year of Jubilee, when it would revert back to the original owner or his heirs. However, Elimelech is dead. His two sons who were his heirs are dead, and they don't have any heirs. He may have realized that Naomi was Elimelech's widow and thought, well, I'll have to marry the old lady, but she's beyond childbearing years, so that's no big deal. I'll still get the land. So this guy realizes that if he redeems this land, it is forever permanently his. It will belong to him and his family for generations to come. Yeah, it will cost him some money up front, but from his perspective, the long-term benefits of this deal couldn't be better. But then Boaz springs the rest of his very strategic proposition on this man, and it's a huge surprise. Verse 5. Then Boaz said, on the day you acquire the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the one who had died, in order to raise up the name of the one who had died on behalf of his inheritance. Now this brings us back to the whole levirate marriage issue, which was discussed in Deuteronomy 25. Basically, the requirement was that the kinsman redeemer had to marry the widowed wife of the deceased relative, and the first son born to that relationship was viewed as the son of the dead relative, and all the inheritance of the dead man passed to that son just as if he was the physical son of that dead man. And that guaranteed the property would stay in the family line. It's a little hard for us to identify with this in our Western culture, but that was the pattern that Israel followed. Also, be sure to notice how Boaz described Ruth. He referred to her as Ruth the Moabitess. There's no question that while Boaz is giving the relative every bit of information he needs to make a decision, he's also playing to the ethnic prejudices that may have been present in the relative. As we've already seen, Moabites were looked down by many in Israel because they were an accursed people. Their nation had come about from incestuous immorality. As a people group, they were known for a history of immorality, and they worshiped false gods. So many people in Israel would look down on a man who would marry a Moabite woman. So Boaz made sure he mentioned that detail to this relative. And all of a sudden, the kinsman redeemer changes his mind. Look at verse 6. So the kinsman redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Listen again as Ian Duguid comments on this verse. He writes, Mr. So-and-so backed away from the deal faster than a man faced with a coiled rattlesnake. What a moment before had seemed to be a can't-miss real estate deal, taking care of an old lady in return for the long-term payoff of a field, had suddenly become an investment nightmare, end quote. Now this guy is very clear here. Twice in this verse, he emphasizes, I cannot redeem it. Those words stand in stark contrast to Boaz. Throughout the entire story, Boaz has always done what was in the best interest of Naomi and Ruth, but this guy is only interested in what benefits himself. And he makes sure that he says that it's not just a matter of not being willing to do so, but rather he says that if he did, he will ruin his own inheritance. Now, so what's he talking about here? Well, what he's saying is that once he considered the cost of purchasing the land and then providing for the care of Naomi, plus the economic costs and social implications of marrying Ruth and supporting all the children she had, he decided it would just be too much of a drain on his financial resources and would jeopardize his own inheritance. Plus, he would pour all kinds of money and effort into producing crops on the field, but whenever Ruth's son grew up, it would all go to him, and the man would be out everything he had invested. He wouldn't even own the land anymore. So Mr. So-and-so is only interested in ministry to the poor widow of his deceased relative if there is a payoff for himself and his family. And he could see a lot of downsides to Boaz's proposal, so he backs away in a flash. So then, so far we've seen Boaz's strategic proposition and the relative's impulsive pledge. Now we come to Boaz's completed purchase. When a redemption of property took place, there had to be a legal transaction which took place in order to attest to the redemption and exchange of the land, just as there is a legal transaction in our day when ownership of real estate is transferred from one person to another. And so the writer inserts a sort of parenthetical addition in verse 7 to explain how that was done. He writes, now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the right of redemption and the exchange of land to establish any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So when a man was going to redeem or purchase land, he removed his sandal and gave it to the other man who was a party to the transaction. Sandals were the most common form of footwear in the ancient world, and this exchange of a sandal served as sort of like a handshake or legal signature in modern times. Many commentators believe that this practice had to do with the idea of walking the land as a symbol of ownership. In Genesis 13:17, God told Abram, "Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you." In Deuteronomy 11:24, when God was explaining the benefits that would come to the Israelites if they obeyed the law, he said, "Every place on which the sole of your foot treads shall be yours." So this exchange of a sandal was the seller's way of saying, "Here, I'm giving you the right to walk through this property as the legal owner." So, verse 8, the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, "Acquire this for yourself." And he removed his sandal. So he takes off his sandal, he gives it to Boaz, and the official transaction is thereby confirmed. In effect, he says, "You can have my right to the land, and this is symbolically giving you the right to walk on it as the legal owner of it." And so by passing his sandal to Boaz, he's passing his right to take possession of that land. And so Mr. Poloni Almoni passes from the scene, never to be seen or heard from again, and to forever be known as the nameless man who refused to do what was right because of his own self-interest. Then Boaz speaks again in verse 9. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses today that I have acquired all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon from the hand of Naomi." Boaz announces to the 10 elders, whom he has selected earlier to be the official witnesses, as well as the crowd which had gathered, that he had purchased Elimelech's estate, and as well as everything that belonged to his 2 deceased sons. Now, what that means is that all the rights and responsibilities of redemption have been officially transferred to Boaz. He's now legally recognized as the Goel, the kinsman redeemer. And then in verse 10, he explains his intentions in regard to Ruth. "And also, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife in order to raise up the name of the one who had died on behalf of his inheritance, so that the name of the one who had died will not be cut off from his brothers or from the gate of his birthplace. You are witnesses today." Boaz announces to the whole crowd, "I'm going to marry Ruth the Moabitess." I'm sure there were some in the crowd whose eyes widened, or their jaw dropped, or they sort of gasped at that statement. Ruth was one of those unworthy Gentiles, one of those despised Moabites. There may have been someone in the crowd who thought, why would an esteemed man in the community with his wealth marry a lowly, impoverished widow? She's so far below his class. In other words, they may not have looked down on Ruth because she was a Moabite, but they looked down on her because she was poor. She was from the bottom end of the socioeconomic scale in life. He's a member of the upper crust. But did you realize that Boaz himself was the child of a despised Gentile sinner? Over in Matthew 1:5, we're told who Boaz's mother was. She was Rahab the prostitute, who turned to Yahweh in saving faith and demonstrated that faith by protecting the Israelite spies at Jericho. So Boaz himself had Gentile Canaanite blood flowing through his veins. But he was such a godly man that he recognized that a poor woman of godly character was of far greater worth than a wealthy woman of ungodly character. So he went through all of this process to acquire her. Whereas Mr. So-and-so had only been concerned about the land that he would receive for himself, Boaz is primarily concerned about Ruth and being obedient to the law to raise up a son who would receive the inheritance which belonged to that son's family. There's no selfish motive here. There's no personal gain. He says, I'm marrying Ruth the Moabitess. I'm not ashamed of who she is or of her background. After all, why would he have been ashamed of Ruth's background when his own mother had a much worse background? I mean, there was never any indication that Ruth was a prostitute like Rahab had been. Ruth was a Gentile like Rahab, but never one who engaged in open public sin like Rahab. So Boaz is not deterred in the least by Ruth's background. And he makes it very clear that the purpose of this marriage is to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. In other words, the land that I'm going to redeem with my money will ultimately not belong to me. It'll belong to Mahlon's son. And he says he's doing that so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off. I find it interesting that the names of Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion are recorded in Scripture for all of eternity because of the actions of this very unselfish man, while Mr. So-and-so, who tried to preserve his inheritance, is no longer remembered by name. His name has been cut off, so to speak. So Boaz says that he doesn't want the name of Mahlon to be cut off from his brothers. Now, obviously, his only biological sibling brother was Chilion, and he's dead too. So this term brothers refers to the rest of Elimelech's and Mahlon's extended family. And he adds, or from the gate of his birthplace. The idea is that the names of Elimelech and Mahlon will be remembered in the gate of Bethlehem, that place where the business affairs and judicial proceedings were carried out. And then Boaz concludes his statement just as he began it by saying, "You are witnesses today." This was his legal declaration that this legal transaction was finally completed. Now notice the crowd and elders' response in verses 11 and 12. Look first at verse 11. And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May Yahweh grant the woman who is coming into your home to be like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and so you shall achieve excellence in Ephrathah and shall proclaim your name in Bethlehem." So all the elders and people standing around the gate all agree they're witnesses to the transaction that's just taken place. And then they break out in this lavish pronouncement of benediction upon Boaz. And this benediction consists of three parts. The first is a prayer for Ruth. They say, "May Yahweh grant the woman who's coming into your home to be like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel." What they're doing is asking that Yahweh will make Ruth as fertile as Rachel and Leah, who between them gave birth to 8 sons and had 4 more surrogate sons. They're the 12 sons of Jacob. They became the founding fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. But what I find most interesting about that statement is that these witnesses are praying that Yahweh will grant this foreign Moabite woman a place among the matriarchs of Israel, right along with their 2 most famous ones, Rachel and Leah. The second part of this benediction is directed at Boaz. The witnesses say, "And you shall achieve excellence in Ephrathah and shall proclaim your name in Bethlehem." The last half of that statement is parallel to the first half. Bethlehem is located in the region of Ephrathah, so those are parallel. And achieve excellence is parallel to shall proclaim. So what are the people saying about Boaz? Well, the answer is found in the meaning of the word excellence. Now, this isn't as easy as you might think, because the Hebrew word translated excellence has multiple meanings. And that comes out when you read the various ways it's translated in our modern English translations, our modern English versions. Some versions translate it to make wealth. Others translate it to be honorable or to act worthily. Now we know from chapter 2 that Boaz was already a man of great wealth. So it's likely the people are wishing him to become renowned as a man of great personal character and worthiness because of what he's done in regard to Elimelech's heritage and Naomi and Ruth's future. He's not required to do this, but he did it. If he hadn't done it, he would have still been a wealthy man in Bethlehem. But by acting in the manner in which he did and redeeming those he didn't have to redeem, he became known as a man of tremendous worth and noble character. The second thing they wish for him is to proclaim your name in Bethlehem. Notice the contrast here. It's almost like they're saying, in contrast to Poloni Almoni, whose name will never be proclaimed, may your name be proclaimed in Bethlehem. And so we see how Boaz is a parallel to our Redeemer. You know, God didn't have to redeem any of us. He was not obligated to do so. But because of his great love with which he loved us, Christ redeemed us and made us his bride. And so for all of eternity, we will proclaim, worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. Christ will forever be famous for his worthy kindness in redeeming those who were unworthy. Then there's a third part of the benediction and blessing which the witnesses bestow on Boaz. They say in verse 12, "Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah through the seed which Yahweh will grant you by this young woman." Now this tells us that the author has been writing this story with Genesis 38 in the back of his mind. I realize that most of you don't know the story of Perez, Tamar, and Judah, but you need to go back to Genesis 38 and read it sometime. It's a rather scandalous story from Israel's past, but it provides an important point in our story of Boaz and Ruth. And it's important because that this story involves the patriarch Judah. Because David was from the tribe of Judah, and ultimately the Messiah will come from that tribe. Revelation 5:5 calls him the lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David. In that story, Judah had 3 sons, and the oldest of them was married to a woman named Tamar. But that son was evil, so God took his life. And Judah told his second son to take Tamar as his wife in a levirate marriage to raise up offspring for his brother, but he didn't want to fulfill that obligation, so God took his life too. Well, Judah was afraid the same thing would happen to his third son, so he delayed in giving Tamar to his third son. So then Tamar realizes the situation, and she developed a plan. She disguised herself as a prostitute, covered her face, and ended up pregnant by Judah, her father-in-law. And when Tamar's pregnancy becomes evident, Judah wants to have her killed for her immorality. Notice it's not about his own immorality, but hers. But when she produces the evidence that he's the one who impregnated her, he realizes that despite her deceitful ways, she's acted in obedience to the law of levirate marriage to carry out the heritage of her deceased husband, so her life is spared. And the story goes on to tell us that she had twins, and the firstborn of the two was Perez. And many years later, Perez's descendants ended up settling in Bethlehem. So the people of Bethlehem are the descendants of Perez, and Boaz was a descendant of Perez. And so when the people of Bethlehem say in verse 12, we want him to be blessed like Perez, that would be something you might expect them to say. But Perez's birth was also an illustration of offspring that came through levirate marriage. And that's what the people want to take place between Boaz and Ruth. So Boaz has completed the purchase of the right to redeem Elimelech's land and to marry Ruth. And that brings us to the story in verses 13 to 17 in which we see God's provision of redemption. Let's begin with verse 13. It says, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her. And Yahweh granted her conception, and she gave birth to a son." Now here we have a leap in time because this single verse of only 15 Hebrew words jumps over at least 9 months in time. We're given no details of their wedding ceremony or how much time elapsed between their marriage and the birth of their son. But there's a couple of notable things about this verse. First of all, it says that Ruth became his wife. That fact completes the social progression of Ruth that has taken place in this book. She's progressed from being a foreigner to being lower than Boaz's lowest slave, to a maidservant, to now being a wife. This is a picture of amazing grace. The one who recognized her low estate in life becomes the bride of a wealthy, highly esteemed man in Bethlehem. The phrase, Yahweh granted her conceptions, an apparent comparison to her marriage to Mahlon. Apparently, Ruth had not been able to conceive during her first marriage, but now God graciously gifts her with the ability to do so, and she gives birth to a son, an heir to carry on the heritage in the name of his family. And here, once again, as throughout the book, we're reminded of the sovereignty of God. Every detail has been sovereignly and specifically determined by God. Perhaps Ruth was barren in her first marriage. We don't know exactly how long she was married to Mahlon, perhaps no longer than a year or two, but no children came out of that marriage. But here, God, by his grace, enables her to conceive, and she gives birth to a son. Now, beginning in verse 14, Ruth drops out of the story, other than by a nameless reference and a commendation of her to Naomi in verse 15. And Naomi again becomes the central figure in the story. And that's appropriate because while this story is titled the Book of Ruth, it could have been titled the Book of Naomi. It's her story too. She was the disobedient Jew living in a foreign land, outside of the covenant which God had with his people in the land, who came back to the land but was embittered towards God because she felt she'd been mistreated by him. But it was her plan for Boaz to redeem Ruth, which Ruth successfully carried out and Boaz completed. And so for the story to return to Naomi at this point is certainly fitting. And now we see a very different Naomi than we saw at the beginning of the story. Although we don't read any words that Naomi said, it's clear that there is a recognition that this woman whose life had once been emptied by God has now experienced his filling. Look at verses 14 and 15. The scene here is that of a group of women from Bethlehem gathering with Naomi outside of the room in which Ruth is giving birth to her son. They're all together, waiting to hear that first cry of a newborn child. And then the child is born and is carried out to meet his grandmother for the first time as all of her lady friends from Bethlehem are gathered around. And these ladies speak and they say, verse 14, "Blessed is Yahweh who has not left you without a kinsman redeemer today, and may his name be proclaimed in Israel." Notice that suddenly Boaz is no longer the Goel, the redeemer, but rather this newborn son is referred to as the Goel. They're not using the term in its technical legal sense as one who will do something for Naomi, but rather they see this child as providing the continuation of the family line. Naomi's dead son Mahlon now has a descendant who will inherit his land and property and keep it in the family. And these women praise Yahweh for providing this heir, this redeemer. They recognize that he is the sovereign one who's shown his goodness and mercy to Naomi. And the ladies add, "And may his name be proclaimed in Israel." They're referring to the baby, particularly because of the connection to what they continue to say in verse 16. So they're praying that this child's name will be proclaimed in Israel. That is, that his name will go down in renown and be called throughout Israel. Now notice the comparison here. At the end of verse 11, the witnesses and the crowd all wished for Boaz's name to be proclaimed in Bethlehem. But now here in verse 14, these women wish for his son's name to be proclaimed in Israel. They are praising God and asking for this child to become even more famous than his father. Little did they know when they said this that this little boy would grow up to be the grandfather of Israel's greatest king. And then in verse 15 they pray, "May he also be to you a restorer of your soul and a sustainer of your old age." That's an interesting statement because Naomi had been embittered about life, and now these women pray that this child will restore her soul. They desire that he will be the one who restores Naomi's hope and spirit. And the phrase, "a sustainer of your old age," is literally translated, "a provider for your gray hair." One version puts it this way, "May he restore your youth and care for you in your old age." And then the women add their commendation of Ruth. They say at the end of verse 15, "For your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him." That's quite a testimony to Ruth, isn't it? They say that having a daughter-in-law like Ruth is better than having 7 sons. And since 7 was the number of completeness in God's plan, the Israelites felt that if a woman had 7 sons, she had the perfect number. So these women tell Naomi, "Listen, your daughter-in-law is better to you than 7 sons. She loves you and she's been more faithful to you than 7 sons. And now she's given birth to a son who is your Goel." Verse 16, "Then Naomi took the child and put him on her bosom and became his nurse." That does not mean that Naomi became his nurse in the sense of nursing the child. It simply means that Naomi became this little boy's doting grandmother, helping to care for him. The same term, same words used in the book of Esther to refer to Mordecai, who raised and took care of Esther. But when the writer includes this detail about Naomi holding this baby, he's showing that Naomi's life has completely changed. When she came from Judah, she had proclaimed, "I went out full, but Yahweh has caused me to return empty." And throughout the story, the writer has thrown in little details to show that Yahweh was providing for her so that she was not empty. First, it was with arms filled with more than enough grain to eat, and now her arms are filled with her grandson, who is the redeemer of her dead son's heritage. God has turned Naomi from an empty, embittered woman to a woman whose life has been truly blessed and filled by God. In verse 17, we're told the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." So they named him Obed. He's the father of Jesse, the father of David. The story narrative comes to a fitting conclusion in the naming of the son born to Ruth. However, it's rather extraordinary for a couple of reasons. First, this is the only time in the Old Testament where females other than the mother are said to be present at the naming of the child. But this statement does not mean that neither Ruth nor Boaz had a say in the naming of the child. That notion would be ludicrous. The women are affirming the name given to the child by his father and mother. But the narrator writes it in a literary form in which these women are acting as sort of like a chorus or as representatives of the community celebrating his birth and declaring its significance. Notice what these neighbor ladies say. They say, a son has been born to Naomi. Naomi didn't bear the son, but for the people of Israel, this is God's provision for Naomi as well as for Ruth. Naomi needed a son to be born to carry on her deceased son's inheritance. So he is, in a sense, her son just as he is Ruth's son. And the name given to this son is the name Obed. That means servant or one who serves. There are no less than 12 other people in the Old Testament who had a form of this name. One of those men was Obadiah, the prophet who wrote the tiny little book that bears his name. So the name of Obed did become famous throughout Israel, as the women had prayed it would, as many men were given a form of his name. And verse 17 concludes by stating, he's the father of Jesse, the father of David. It's remarkable, isn't it? All of a sudden, here we are at the man David, Israel's greatest king, until we come to the Messiah himself. Ruth the Moabitess is the mother of Obed, who's the father of Jesse, who's the father of David, and that enables us now to have the genealogy to close out this book, which I've entitled David's Thought-Provoking Pedigree. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through each detail of these verses, but you might wonder why the writer would tag on this little genealogy at the end of the book. I mean, what's the purpose of doing that? Well, the purpose is to underscore the sovereign significance of Obed in God's plan of redemption. Here we see that God has been pursuing far bigger plans than simply bringing together two worthy individuals. What looked like a simple story of personal emptiness being filled and personal needs being met turns out to be God's way of meeting a far greater need. It begins in verse 18 by saying, now these are the generations of Perez, which brings us back again to Perez. He was the son of Judah by Tamar, so this genealogy is hooked back to Judah, because the kingly line had to come through Judah. Ultimately, the Messiah has to come through Judah, and this is the only place in the Old Testament where we can make that connection to Judah's line and the Davidic line leading us to the Messiah. If you go to the New Testament and look at the genealogy in Matthew 1, you'll see the connection there. But remember, the writer isn't writing for New Testament people, he's writing for Old Testament people. This is the only place they would be able to make the connection and fill in the gap between Judah and David. So when they read in Genesis 49:10 that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh, that is Messiah, comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. And then when they read 2 Samuel 7, where God promised David that the Messiah would come through his line, rather than be confused about how those two were connected, they could then look at these verses in Ruth 4 and see how Judah's line connected up with David. And so we get a picture of the sovereign hand of God. What seemed like random events, sometimes of a tragic and frustrating nature and character, were in reality the work of a sovereign, gracious God in accomplishing his program. No mistakes, no errors. It's all part of God's plan to bring about the continuation of the line of David. And so when you go to the book of Matthew, you find Ruth listed as one of the 3 women named in the genealogical line of the Messiah. So as we wrap all of this up and move into our celebration of the Lord's Supper, Bible teachers have said for years that Boaz functions as a type of Christ. How is that? How can we say that's so? How can we say that Boaz, by functioning as a kinsman redeemer, provides us with a valid type of Jesus Christ? Well, I think there's several ways. First, the kinsman redeemer had to be related. He had to be a relative of the one being redeemed. Boaz was a relative of Elimelech, and thus he fulfilled that requirement. And the scriptures tell us that God took on human flesh and became a man so that he could become our kinsman redeemer. Hebrews 2:17 tells us, therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in all things so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. He became our kinsman in order to redeem us. Secondly, a kinsman redeemer had to be able to pay the price of the redemption. A kinsman redeemer could not be in debt himself. He had to be in a position to pay. Boaz was able to pay that price for Naomi and Ruth. And Jesus Christ could do that because he had no sin debt. He was without sin. That's so crucial. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Hebrews 4:15 tells us he has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. If he was not without sin, he would have been unable and unqualified to pay the redemption price. Third, a kinsman redeemer had to be willing to pay the price. We read in Leviticus 25, the kinsman redeemer had to be willing to pay that. Just as Boaz was willing to pay the price for Ruth, so too Jesus Christ was willing to pay the price for us. Redemption is deliberate and planned. It's also costly to the Redeemer. And in the case of Jesus, it was infinitely costly. He had to satisfy the infinite cost of the demands of a just and holy God so that we could be redeemed. But John 10, verse 15, 17, and 18 tell us that Jesus willingly laid down his life for his sheep. He is our go-well, our Redeemer. So as we remember the Lord's death for us, focus on what it cost him for our redemption. But first, let's bow together in prayer. Father, as we come to the Lord's table in a few moments, we remember our Lord, our Redeemer. We remember that he paid the price of our redemption on the cross. That price, though, was not like that which Boaz paid. Boaz paid out of his substance. Jesus paid with his own life, his own blood. And he purchased a cursed bride, a bride doomed to judgment, but bought with a price. Not with silver and gold, but with precious blood of a lamb without blemish and without spot. This is the cross, Lord, where our kinsman redeemer, holy God, living in human flesh as a man, paid the full price to redeem us from the curse and take us out of our spiritual poverty and bankruptcy and bring us into eternal blessing. And so as we come to the cross, may we once again meet with our Redeemer with hearts filled to overflowing with gratitude. In the precious name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, our Goel, we pray. Amen. The Apostle Paul tells us